Nurse turns away. Single dad at hospital unaware he's the major donor. The security guard's hand was already on his radio. Two nurses stood behind the front desk, arms crossed, watching a man in a faded gray hoodie plead his case for the third time. "Sir, I've told you already. Visiting hours are over. You need to leave the building." "My daughter is in room 412, he said quietly. "She's scared. I just want 5 minutes. The nurse at the desk, a woman named Diane with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, didn't even look up from her computer screen. "Rules are rules. If we let every parent break protocol, this hospital would be chaos." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had lost every battle he'd ever fought and had learned not to expect to win this one either. "Please," he said. "Just 5 minutes." "Security," Diane said, not to him, but past him, toward the guard now walking over. "Please escort this man out." What none of them knew, what nobody in that lobby had any way of knowing, was that the name printed on the small brass plaque bolted to the wall behind them, the one that read the Callahan family wing, belonged to the man they were about to throw out onto the sidewalk. And in exactly 11 days, that same man would be sitting across a boardroom table from the hospital's entire executive board, deciding whether Mercy General deserved another cent of his money or whether it was time to build somewhere else, somewhere his daughter and people like her would actually be treated like human beings. But that was still 11 days away. Right now, all he wanted was to see his little girl. The guard's hand landed on his shoulder. "Let's go, buddy," the guard said. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." 3 weeks earlier, none of this had started yet. 3 weeks earlier, Daniel Callahan was just a tired father driving through the rain, trying to figure out how he was going to tell his 6-year-old daughter that her fever wasn't going away on its own. Daniel Callahan didn't look like a man who mattered. He drove a 12-year-old pickup truck with a dent in the tailgate he'd never bothered to fix. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts on rotation, and his boots had long since stopped looking new. If you passed him in a grocery store, you might guess he worked construction, or maybe drove a delivery route. You would not have guessed that his name was on university buildings in 4 different states, or that a wing of Mercy General Hospital had been built, in part, with a check he'd written 5 years earlier without telling a single reporter about it. That was exactly how Daniel liked it. He'd grown up with nothing. His father worked nights at a steel plant that didn't exist anymore, and his mother cleaned houses on the west side of town until her knees gave out. Daniel used to sit at their kitchen table doing homework by a single bulb, promising himself that someday, if he ever had money, he wouldn't become the kind of person who forgot what it felt like not to have any. Then he did have money. A lot of it. A software company he'd built out of a garage with 2 friends and a lot of stubbornness had sold for more than he'd ever imagined possible. And true to the promise he'd made himself as a kid, he never let it change who he was on the outside. He still wore flannel. He still drove the truck. He gave away more than most foundations gave away in a year, and he did it quietly, through lawyers and trusts, never once putting his name in a press release if he could help it. The only thing that had truly cracked him open, the only thing that had ever made him feel powerless despite everything he had, was his daughter Emma. Emma was 6 years old, with a gap-toothed smile and a stubborn streak that Daniel secretly loved, even when it drove him crazy. Her mother had passed away when Emma was 2, an illness that came fast and left just as fast, and since then it had been the 2 of them. Daniel had scaled back everything, board meetings, business trips, even most of his philanthropic work, just so he could be the one to pick her up from kindergarten, the one who sat with her during nightmares, the one who mattered more to her than a title or a bank account ever would. So when Emma started running a fever that wouldn't break, when her small body seemed to fold into itself with exhaustion no 6-year-old should feel, Daniel didn't think about hospitals or donor walls or foundations. He thought about one thing only. He needed his daughter to be okay. Mercy General was the closest hospital, and also, quietly, one Daniel knew well. He had funded an entire pediatric wing there 5 years earlier, after watching a friend's child go through a diagnosis in a facility that didn't have the right equipment. He'd done it under an LLC, with a lawyer as the public point of contact, specifically so nobody at the hospital would recognize his face and start treating him differently. He wanted to be treated the way any parent should be treated, not with special favors, but with basic decency. He was about to learn that basic decency wasn't as guaranteed as he'd hoped. The emergency room at Mercy General was busy that night, the kind of busy where the fluorescent lights seemed to hum just a little too loud and every chair in the waiting area was filled with someone in some quiet state of worry. Daniel carried Emma in himself, her head resting against his shoulder, her small arms wrapped weakly around his neck. "Daddy, it hurts," she murmured. "I know, baby. We're gonna get you fixed up." At the intake desk sat a woman named Diane Whitfield, a nurse with almost 20 years at Mercy General and a reputation, among the newer staff, for running her section like a strict schoolteacher running a classroom. She wasn't cruel by nature, not exactly. She was overworked, underslept, and had developed, over 2 decades, a habit of sorting people quickly into categories. People who looked like they had insurance. People who looked like they didn't. People who looked like they'd cause trouble. People who wouldn't. Daniel, in his flannel and worn boots, with no wedding ring and a truck that needed a wash, got sorted fast. "Insurance card," Diane said, not unkindly, but flatly, the way you'd ask for a parking ticket. Daniel handed it over along with his ID. Diane glanced at it, typed for a moment, then glanced back up at him with an expression that had already made up its mind about something. "We're pretty backed up tonight," she said. "You're looking at a 2, maybe 3-hour wait unless it's life-threatening." "She's got a fever of 104, Daniel said quietly, adjusting Emma in his arms. "She hasn't kept food down in 2 days." "I understand, sir, but I have people ahead of you with active chest pain and a possible fracture. I'll get you back as soon as I can." It wasn't an unreasonable answer. Triage was triage. Daniel understood that, and he nodded, finding a seat in the corner of the waiting room. Emma curled against him, her small body shivering despite the blanket he'd wrapped her in. What stung wasn't the weight. It was the tone. It was the way Diane's eyes had swept over him for exactly 2 seconds before she decided what kind of father he was, the kind who didn't need urgency, the kind who could sit and wait, the kind whose daughter's pain could be filed under not yet. An hour passed. Then another. Around the 90-minute mark, Daniel approached the desk again, careful to keep his voice calm, controlled. He'd learned a long time ago that anger rarely opened doors, it usually just confirmed whatever assumption someone already had about you. "Excuse me," he said. "Her fever's gotten worse. She's starting to seem disoriented." Diane didn't even look up from her screen this time. "I hear you, sir. I'll flag it. Please have a seat." He went back and sat down. Across the waiting room, he noticed an elderly woman sitting alone, clutching her purse, occasionally glancing at the desk with the same helpless expression Daniel imagined was on his own face. Nobody had come to check on her either. It was another 40 minutes before a young doctor finally called Emma's name, and by then her fever had crept even higher. The diagnosis, once they finally got back to a room, was a severe bacterial infection that had progressed further than it should have, mostly because of the delay in getting treated. The attending physician, a kind but rushed man named Dr. Osei, admitted Emma for observation and started her on 4 antibiotics. "She's going to be okay," he told Daniel, "but if you'd waited another day to bring her in, we'd be having a very different conversation." Daniel nodded, throat tight, and thanked him. He didn't mention the 2.5-hour wait. He didn't mention Diane. He just focused on his daughter, now sleeping in a hospital bed with color slowly returning to her cheeks. Over the next several days, as Emma's treatment continued, Daniel noticed a pattern that troubled him more than any single incident could have. It wasn't just him. Diane, and a couple of other staff members who orbited around her, seemed to run an informal ranking system for how patients and families were treated, a ranking system based entirely on appearance, on how people talked, on how they were dressed, on whether they seemed like the kind of people worth the extra effort. He watched a young mother, clearly exhausted from working a double shift before coming straight to the hospital, get talked over by a nurse explaining a treatment plan too fast, too dismissively, as though the woman's questions were an inconvenience. He watched an older man, a war veteran according to the cap he wore, get told to wait his turn for a wheelchair while a well-dressed family walked past and had one produced for their elderly relative within minutes. And then there was Marcus. Marcus was maybe 19, sitting in the family lounge outside the pediatric wing most evenings, keeping vigil for his little brother, who was 3 doors down from Emma's room, undergoing treatment for leukemia. Marcus wore the same hoodie every day. He didn't have a car, so he took 2 buses to get to the hospital after his shift at a grocery store, arriving exhausted, sometimes not eating dinner because he wanted to spend every possible minute with his brother. Daniel had started nodding to him in the hallway, the quiet solidarity of 2 people whose whole world had narrowed down to a hospital room. One evening, Daniel came out to get coffee and found Marcus standing at the nurse's station, voice shaking, trying to ask a question about his brother's treatment schedule so he could figure out his work hours around it. "I'm not family listed on the chart, so I can't give you that information," Diane told him, her tone clipped. "He's my brother. Our mom works nights, she can't always be here. I just need to know when the treatments are so I can be here for them. I understand that's difficult, but I have policies to follow. Have your mother call in?" "She's asleep right now, she works overnights, I really can't help you with that." "I'm sorry." She wasn't sorry. Daniel could hear it in her voice. What he heard instead was the particular flatness of someone protecting a system rather than a person, someone who had stopped seeing the human being in front of her and started seeing only a policy that needed enforcing. Marcus walked away toward the vending machines, shoulders slumped, and Daniel watched him press his forehead against the glass of the machine for a long moment before straightening up and going back to sit outside his brother's room, alone, uninformed, doing the best he could with nothing. Daniel didn't say anything that night. But something in him had shifted. He thought about the wing he'd funded, the one with his family name quietly attached to a foundation nobody at this front desk seemed to have ever heard of. He thought about the mission statement he'd insisted the hospital adopt as a condition of the donation, words about dignity, about treating every family with the same compassion regardless of circumstance. Words that were apparently just words, framed and mounted somewhere in an administrative hallway nobody bothered to walk down. The next day brought the moment that would change everything. Emma had been improving steadily, but on the 5th night, her fever spiked again unexpectedly, a common but frightening complication, according to the on-call resident. Daniel had stepped out briefly to grab something to eat, the first real break he'd taken in days, and returned to find visiting hours had technically ended 11 minutes earlier. He hadn't even made it to the elevator before Diane intercepted him in the lobby. "Sir, visiting hours are over." "I know, I just stepped out for 10 minutes. My daughter's in 412, she's not doing well tonight, I need to get back to her." "I understand you're concerned, but we have to maintain the same rules for everyone. If we make an exception for you, we'd have to make it for everyone. I'm not asking for an exception. I was already here. I just need to go back up. You'll need to come back tomorrow during regular hours." Something in Daniel, something that had been quietly compressing for 5 days, finally reached its limit, not into anger, but into something quieter and more resolute. "My daughter is scared and running a fever in a room upstairs, and you're telling me I can't go be with her because I stepped out to eat for 10 minutes? Sir, I need you to lower your voice." He hadn't raised it. But Diane had already turned, already reaching for the radio at her hip, already deciding, the way she'd been deciding about him since the moment he walked in 5 nights earlier, exactly what kind of problem he was. "Security, please escort this gentleman out of the building." The guard who approached, a heavy-set man named Tom who'd worked at Mercy General for 6 years and generally hated confrontations, put a hand lightly on Daniel's shoulder. "Let's go, buddy. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Daniel looked at the small brass plaque on the wall behind the desk. The Callahan family wing. Nobody in the lobby had ever connected that name to the tired man in the flannel shirt standing in front of them, and in that moment, standing there being physically walked toward the exit doors of a building he had helped build, Daniel made a decision. He would not raise his voice. He would not pull rank, not tonight, not while Emma needed calm more than she needed a scene. He let the guard walk him to the doors. He stepped out into the cool night air, pulled out his phone, and called the one number in this hospital that would actually pick up for him at 11 at night, the hospital's chief administrative officer, a woman named Patricia Yu, who had personally handled his donation 5 years earlier and was one of only 3 people on staff who knew who he really was. Patricia, he said, voice steady. I need you to meet me in the lobby. And I need you to bring the current visiting policy and the current employee conduct guidelines with you. Patricia, you arrived at Mercy General 19 minutes later, hair still damp from having clearly rushed out of the shower, badge clipped hastily to her blazer. She found Daniel standing calmly outside the sliding glass doors, and the moment she saw his face, her own expression shifted from confusion to concern. Mr. Callahan, what happened? Diane, still at the front desk, glanced up at the sound of that name and felt something cold settle in her stomach, the way it does when a word you've heard 100 times suddenly appears in a completely different context and rearranges everything around it. Callahan. She looked at the brass plaque on the wall. She looked at the man in the flannel shirt. She looked back at Patricia Yu, the hospital's second highest administrator, speaking to him with the kind of deference usually reserved for board members. Wait, Diane said slowly, standing up from her chair. Callahan, like the wing you work 15 feet away from every single shift, Patricia said, not unkindly, but with an edge of exhaustion that suggested she already had a good idea of what she was about to hear. Mr. Callahan, I am so sorry. Please, come in, let's go see Emma right now. Daniel walked back through the doors he'd just been escorted out of, this time with the hospital's own administrator at his side. Diane stood frozen behind the desk, her face draining of color as 5 nights of small decisions began replaying rapidly behind her eyes, the tone she'd used, the 2.5-hour wait, the way she'd looked at Marcus, the way she'd looked at Daniel every single time, and decided, without knowing anything true about him, exactly how much he deserved. There has to be some mistake, Diane said quietly, mostly to herself. There wasn't a mistake. There was simply a truth that had been standing in front of her the entire time, wearing a hoodie instead of a suit, and she had never once bothered to look past the hoodie to see it. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't even look at Diane directly as he walked past the desk. His only focus was getting back to his daughter's room, where Emma was awake, frightened, asking a nurse where her dad had gone. I'm here, baby, he said, sitting beside her bed, taking her small hand in his. I'm not going anywhere. Patricia stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the two of them, then quietly stepped out to make a phone call that would set the next 11 days in motion. The following morning, Diane was called into a meeting with Patricia Yu and the hospital's director of nursing. She sat in a small conference room, hands folded tightly in her lap, replaying the last 5 nights over and over, trying to find some version of events where she hadn't been unkind, only realistic, only following policy. But policy hadn't required the tone in her voice. Policy hadn't required refusing basic information to a terrified 19-year-old brother. Policy hadn't required deciding, within 2 seconds of meeting someone, exactly how much patience and dignity they deserved. I want to be clear, Patricia said, this isn't about who Mr. Callahan is. It's about how you treated a frightened parent, and how you've apparently been treating other families, based on things that have nothing to do with the actual policy. We've had 3 other complaints about your desk interactions this year alone. Diane opened her mouth to defend herself and found, for the first time in a long while, that she didn't have a defense that held up under her own scrutiny. I need some time to review this with HR, Patricia continued. But I want you to understand something important. This isn't just about Mr. Callahan's donations. It's about the fact that everyone who walks through those doors deserves the same care, whether they can write this hospital a check or not. That's supposed to be the whole point. Diane was placed on administrative leave pending a formal review, not fired outright, not yet, because Daniel, once he learned the details, had specifically asked for something other than immediate termination. He wanted to understand the full picture first. He wanted to know if this was one exhausted, burnt-out woman who'd let bad habits calcify over 20 tired years, or something crueler than that. He asked to meet with her directly, 3 days later, in Patricia's office. Diane arrived braced for humiliation. What she got instead was a quiet man in the same flannel shirt, sitting across a small table, looking at her with an expression that held more curiosity than anger. I'm not here to make you grovel, Daniel said. I want to understand something. That young man, Marcus, the one with the brother in oncology. Why wouldn't you help him? Diane's throat tightened. Policy says only listed family members can receive detailed updates. He is family. He's the kid's brother. He wasn't on the chart. Could you have helped him get on the chart? Could you have made one phone call to make his mother's life easier, instead of turning a scared teenager away twice? Diane was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller than before. I could have. I didn't think about it that way. I think I stopped thinking about people that way a long time ago. It's easier not to. That's the part that worries me, Daniel said. Not that you made one bad call on one bad night. Everybody has those. It's that it sounds like a habit. And habits are what people actually experience, day after day, long after any one donor forgets to notice. In the days that followed, Daniel learned more about the situation than he'd expected to. Diane, it turned out, had been an excellent, compassionate nurse for the first 15 years of her career. Colleagues described a woman who used to stay late without being asked, who used to remember patients' birthdays, who had once driven an elderly patient home herself because the man had no family to pick him up. Something had changed after her divorce 4 years earlier, and further after her own mother's difficult, drawn-out passing in a hospital not unlike this one, where Diane had watched overworked staff treat her mother as a number instead of a person. She had come back to work bitter, guarded, and somewhere along the way, without meaning to, had started treating the families in front of her the way she'd been afraid her mother had been treated, except now she was the one doing the treating. It didn't excuse what had happened. But it explained it, and Daniel found that the explanation mattered to him. Tom, the security guard, was a different case entirely. Tom hadn't made the decision to turn Daniel away. He'd simply followed an instruction from a nurse he trusted, in a system where guards were taught not to question staff calls. When Daniel met briefly with him, Tom's apology was immediate and clearly sincere. I should have asked more questions, Tom said. I just did what I was told. That's not a good enough excuse, I know. It's not a good excuse, Daniel agreed. But it's an honest one. You didn't build the culture that made that moment happen. You just worked inside it. Daniel didn't push for any consequences for Tom at all. Marcus's situation resolved the fastest and, to Daniel, mattered the most. Patricia personally walked Marcus through getting properly listed as an emergency contact and information recipient on his brother's chart, and Daniel, quietly and without ceremony, arranged for a hospital shuttle service to pick Marcus up near his apartment each evening so he wouldn't have to take 2 buses after closing shifts at the grocery store. He never told Marcus where the idea came from. He just wanted the exhausted kid to be able to sit with his brother a few minutes longer each night. When word eventually spread through the hospital about who Daniel Callahan really was, not through any announcement Daniel made, but through the inevitable hospital grapevine, the reactions varied. Some staff members were embarrassed, worried they'd been short with him at some point over the years without knowing it. Others were simply relieved that someone with real influence had noticed the pattern of behavior at that front desk and was doing something about it instead of just writing another check and walking away. 11 days after the night Daniel was walked out of Mercy General's lobby by a security guard, he sat at the head of a long table in a boardroom on the hospital's top floor, across from the CEO, the director of nursing, Patricia Yu, and 4 members of the hospital's governing board. They had expected, understandably, a difficult conversation about withdrawing future funding. Instead, Daniel opened a folder and slid copies across the table. I'm not here to pull my support, he said. Emma got excellent medical care once she was actually seen. Dr. Osei saved my daughter's life, and I mean that literally. This hospital has good bones. But I want to propose something, and I want your honest reaction to it. He explained his idea, a mandatory frontline training program, not about medical procedure, but about the basic dignity of triage interactions, how tone matters as much as timing, how a 2-hour wait handled with warmth feels entirely different than the same wait handled with dismissal. He proposed an anonymous family feedback system that actually got reviewed by leadership every month, not filed away. And he proposed funding a small emergency assistance fund specifically for situations like Marcus's, families falling through cracks that policy hadn't been written flexible enough to catch. This isn't about punishing one nurse, Daniel said. It's about making sure the next tired dad who walks in here in a hoodie, whether he's a donor or not, whether he ever will be or not, gets treated like his kid matters just as much as anyone else's. The board approved the proposal unanimously within the hour. As for Diane, after the formal review concluded, the hospital offered her a choice rather than a termination, a choice Daniel had specifically advocated for. She could resign, or she could go through a supervised probationary period that included the very training program Daniel had proposed, alongside real accountability and real oversight, with the understanding that one more substantiated complaint would end her employment permanently. She chose to stay. 6 months later, Patricia mentioned to Daniel, almost in passing, that Diane had become one of the most requested trainers for the new front desk empathy program, not because she'd become someone else entirely, but because she understood, more clearly than most, exactly how easy it was to slide into the version of herself she didn't want to be, and exactly what it looked like to climb back out. Emma recovered fully. Within 2 weeks of coming home, she was back to arguing with Daniel about bedtime and insisting on picking out her own outrageous outfit combinations for school, and Daniel had never in his life been so grateful for an argument about mismatched socks. He never told her the full story of what had happened in that hospital lobby. She was 6. She didn't need to carry that. What she did notice, months later, was that her dad started taking her with him sometimes on quiet Saturday mornings to visit a hospital gift shop, where they'd buy a stack of coloring books and small toys, which they'd then deliver, unannounced, to the pediatric wing waiting room, no name attached, no cameras, no ceremony. "Why do we do this, Daddy?" Emma asked once, arranging the coloring books in a neat little stack. "Because somebody should," Daniel said. "And because we can." He thought, sometimes, about that first night, about Diane's flat voice, about the guard's hand on his shoulder, about how close he'd come to simply walking away angry and never looking back, using his money the way plenty of wealthy men eventually do, as a wall instead of a bridge. It would have been easy. He had every resource in the world to simply build his own hospital somewhere else and let Mercy General fade into irrelevance for people like Diane and people like Marcus's family. But that wasn't the kind of man his own parents had raised, and it wasn't the kind of father he wanted Emma to grow up watching. Real power, he'd come to believe, wasn't about the ability to make people disappear when they wronged you. It was about the discipline to fix the actual problem instead of just punishing the nearest person standing in front of it. He thought about Marcus too, who visited Emma's room once during her final days in the hospital, awkwardly holding a small stuffed rabbit he'd bought with money he clearly didn't have much of, just to say thank you for something he still didn't fully understand the size of. Daniel had made sure, quietly, that Marcus's brother's treatment would be fully covered for as long as it took, routed through the hospital's new emergency fund so it never had to look like charity from one man to another, just a system finally working the way it was supposed to. A year later, Mercy General's front desk looked mostly the same. Same chairs. Same fluorescent lights humming just a little too loud. But there was a new laminated card taped discreetly near every workstation, a simple reminder for staff: every person who walks through this door is somebody's whole world. Treat them like it. Diane kept one on her desk long after the others had faded and been quietly replaced. Daniel never became a public figure because of what happened that night. He never gave an interview about it, never let the hospital put his name on anything more visible than it already was. But every so often, late at night, waiting rooms across that hospital were a little warmer than they used to be, a little more patient, a little more willing to see the tired man in the flannel shirt or the exhausted teenager in the worn hoodie as exactly what they were: someone's whole world, standing quietly at the desk, hoping somebody would notice. You never really know who's standing in front of you. So maybe the safest, kindest rule isn't to guess who deserves your patience and who doesn't. Maybe it's simply to give it to everyone, every time, as if it were the only thing you had left to offer, because for someone, someday, it will be exactly that.